Have you ever felt invisible, unheard, forgotten? I want you to picture a woman alone in the wilderness. She's pregnant. She's afraid. She's been rejected. Culturally, she has no rights, no power, no voice. We're talking about Hagar. And in that wilderness, she discovers something shocking about God. Something that might change the way that you see Him too. Think about it for just a moment. When life pushes you to the margins, when people treat you as if you don't matter, you're simply insignificant, what if God is still watching? What if God is already pursuing you? That's exactly what happened with Hagar. And today we're going to unpack her story, step by step, so that you can understand what it truly means when Scripture says, "Thou, God, seest me."
This is Context Counts, the podcast where we don't just read the Bible, we understand it. Because when you take Scripture out of context, you miss its meaning. Now our host, Pastor Nathan Browning.
Let's begin by reading Genesis 16:13. And she called the name of the Lord that spake unto her, "Thou, God, seest me." For she said, "Have I also here looked after him that seeth me?" When people talk about the God who sees me, they usually quote this line from Hagar. It's beautiful, isn't it? It rolls off the tongue. It sounds comforting. But without knowing the story behind it, oftentimes we can miss the full impact. You see, Hagar's situation was nothing short of desperate. She was a slave. She was a foreigner. She was a woman in a world that valued neither. And yet, God pursued her. Genesis 16 is more than a story of suffering. It's a story of divine pursuit. A story about a God who sees the unseen and a God who reverses the expectations of the world. Today we're going to explore Hagar's story through four lenses: the historical context, the literary context, the wilderness encounter, and the theological and practical lessons for us today. By the end, I want you to see what Hagar saw, that God is not distant. He sees, He hears, He meets us in the wilderness. Let's start with the historical context. So, to understand Hagar, we have to understand her world, where she lived. First, Hagar the Egyptian. She was not just a servant, she's a foreigner, a slave, and as we said before, a woman. And in Mesopotamian culture, she was looked at as property at this point. Imagine that for a second. A person considered property, no rights, no voice, no power to decide her own future. Everything in her life was dictated by someone else. Next, we see that she's a surrogate mother. This may seem strange today, that surrogate motherhood practice, but in the ancient Near East, it was common. If a wife was barren, she could give her maidservant to her husband, and any child born would legally belong to the wife. So when Sarai gave Hagar to Abram, it wasn't shocking culturally, it was expected. But spiritually, it really did show a lack of faith on Abram and Sarai's part. Instead of trusting God's promise, they created their own solution. Finally, the social hierarchy. We see at the top we have Abram. Next we have Sarai. At the bottom we have Hagar. She did not act. She was acted upon. She had no choice in the matter. She had no control. Understanding this is key. It's essential to knowing the story, because it makes the reversal at the end all the more shocking. Imagine being at the very bottom, powerless, voiceless, invisible. And yet God comes looking for you. Next, let's look at the literary context. Now, in this literary context, we have Genesis 12 through 16 as a continuous story. And God promised Abram descendants. And years passed. Sarai remained barren, and instead of trusting God, they created their own solution. Does that sound familiar? A lot of times we do the same thing. Sometimes we try to solve problems in our own strength. We look for shortcuts instead of waiting on God's timing. Genesis 16 shows us that human shortcuts almost always lead to human suffering. We also see echoes of Genesis 3 with the story of Eden. The pattern at least seems familiar. Listening to the wrong voice, taking matters into human hands. Blame and brokenness are the result. Once Hagar becomes pregnant, the power dynamic shifts. She's despised, and she despises Sarai. This isn't rebellion for rebellion's sake, it's survival. In her culture, motherhood meant social elevation. Sarai responds not with humility, but with a harshness. Hagar's story is messy. It's complicated. And isn't life often messy and complicated? But God shows up most clearly in the mess. Third, we're going to look at the wilderness. Hagar runs. She's alone. She's pregnant. She's vulnerable. Into the wilderness she goes to hide. Then comes the shock. The angel of the Lord found her in verse 7. Not Abraham, not Sarai, not a distant deity. The God of Abraham found Hagar. The God of the household that mistreated her found her, chases her into the desert, and found her where she was. This is radical grace. God asks her two questions. Look at them in Scripture. He asks her, where did you come from and where will you go? Not because he doesn't know, but to surface her pain, to reveal her fear, and to bring her hope. Can you hear that? God isn't distant. God isn't passive. He meets us in the wilderness. He meets us in the place where we feel invisible, where we're the most vulnerable. So then we see a message of hope in this theological reversal. God tells Hagar to return, but not empty-handed. He gives her three things. First, we see a covenant-like promise in verse 10. I will multiply thy seed exceedingly. I will multiply thy seed exceedingly, that it shall not be numbered for multitude. This is the same language that God used with Abraham. Hagar was a slave, a foreigner, a woman, and she receives the promise. This promise that's reserved mostly for kings and patriarchs. Imagine that for a second. A person at the bottom of society receives a promise that's normally reserved for kings and patriarchs. That is grace. Then we see the name of her son. His name in verse 11, Ishmael, because the Lord hath heard thy affliction. Ishmael means the God who hears. Her son will not be forgotten, and neither will she. Then we see the third promise, a future. He will be a wild man. He will be against every man's hand against him. Freedom. We see a great nation even promised. Even in the wilderness, even at the margins, God is already shaping the destiny of her child. Hagar leaves that encounter not the same as she came. She leaves with hope, with a future, with confirmation that she is seen. And then Hagar responds, Thou, God, seest me. This is the only time in Scripture where a human gives God a name. El Roi, the God who sees me. Not the God who sees in general, not the God who sees only the righteous, but the God who sees the unseen, the vulnerable, the invisible. Her response becomes geography as she names the well, Bir Lecharoi, the well of the living one who sees me. then her worship becomes memorial, and her story becomes revelation. Imagine naming God because he met you in your deepest need, recognizing that he just doesn't see in general, but that he sees you. That is Hagar's testimony. That is the context behind this passage. Now we see the application. What does this mean for us today? God needs people at their lowest. He sees the oppressed. When people mistreat you, God sees. He sees the wounded. He sees the hurt. Your pain does not go unnoticed. God sees it. He recognizes it. He understands it. He sees the forgotten. Hagar was a maid, again, a migrant. She was a mother-to-be, yet God sought her out. He sees the runaway. Some run from pain. Some run from responsibility. Some run from people. Hagar ran from all of the above. And God ran after her. He sought her out. He found her. He's the God that sees the in-between places, between home and the wilderness, between despair and hope, between rejection and redemption. Those are the places where God meets people. And often, those are the same places where God reveals himself most clearly. Think about your own in-between place. What in-between place could you be residing in? Where is God meeting you today? You see, Hagar's story teaches us that context truly counts. In her world, she was invisible, voiceless, powerless. Ultimately, she was expendable. But to God, she was known. She was heard. She was seen. She was pursued. The God of Genesis 16 is the same today. He's the God who sees, the God who hears, the God who meets people in the wilderness. Remember that he sees you too. He knows where you're at. He understands your pain. He's a high priest that loves and that cares.
Thanks for listening to Context Counts. If this episode helped you see Scripture more clearly, share it with someone who needs it. And remember, context counts because meaning matters.